Okay, so this is a topic that I have been meaning to present for a while. So apologize, it's moved around a few times. When I was thinking about what to call it, I kind of struggled between calling it, just making it a blah topic and saying, how do you develop and deploy SaaS software? But there's an art to it, and that's why I wanted to make sure that we understand it's not a perfect science. There's an art to deploying SaaS software, and hopefully, let's keep this interactive. Hopefully, as we get through the presentation, you'll be able to take something out of this presentation that you can apply on your daily basis when you make decisions on the software that you're developing and deploying for our customers. So, with that, there's really three main topics that I want to talk about today. One is really, take a step back and think about what are the concerns that any software development organization deals with, and what are some of the strategies that has been applied since beginning of time, and why is SaaS important, right? So let's then talk about that, and then we'll talk about why SaaS, right? What is so cool about SaaS, and then get into the more tangible topic of what's involved with developing good SaaS software, because I'll tell you, not every SaaS software is created equal. Okay, let's just start with the basics, right? When you are developing software, whether you're a business developing a software for your own company, or you're a software vendor like us who's developing software to be used by other businesses, there is a set of concerns, these basic concerns that you have to keep in mind, right? You have, starting with, you have to think about servers. You got to think about storage. You got to think about networking. You got to think about what kind of virtualization software you're going to use. You got to think about the operating system on which you're going to host it. You're going to then talk about middleware, runtime, and then you develop your apps, and then you got to think about how the data model works and all of that stuff. These are all the concerns, and it doesn't matter what strategy you apply for developing and deploying software. Those are the concerns, that you are going to deal with, right? As you go back in time, some of these concerns may not have existed because, if you go back, I'm going to call anything beyond 20 years as beginning of time, just as a frame of reference. So, virtualization may not have been a concern, right? Because virtualization did not exist as a concept. So, but you can look at it and say, yes, servers always existed, storage always existed, networking was always there. So you had to deal with these things, and there were several strategies, right? Originally people just developed software, deployed on premise. Some of you are too young to even know, but I have actually seen software where people developed it and deployed it on their desktop that sat under their desk. So when people talk about, hey, is this software running under your desk, there is a reason for that. There are companies that were run that way, and when computers failed, they were like, whoa, what do we do now, right? That did exist. Then infrastructure as a service came up, and we'll talk about the details of what each of these things mean, and then platform as a service, and then software as a service. Each of these strategies addresses each of these concerns to varying degrees, right? So let's just dig into how these strategies addresses some of these concerns that I laid out here. So if you think about anything that's in yellow is a concern of the business that is dealing with that software, right? So if it's on-premise, it doesn't matter whether you bought the software from someone else or you developed it yourself, you're going to deal with all of these concerns yourself, right? If you're an on-prem kind of a software deployment model, if you're a business, buying software or developing software, you're going to have people, money, all of those concerns. You've got to deal with all of those things, right? I mean, there is advantages, there is use cases where an on-prem absolutely makes sense, right? We can go into that. And there are certain classes of industries, there are certain classes of businesses, who will do on-prem, right? Because, for various reasons. But those businesses that absolutely need on-prem is a very minority population. Even though some companies And some businesses say, we absolutely need it on-prem. They usually are not.
Do you have an example?
So an example would be someone who deals with intelligence, or someone who deals with like a healthcare industry which is developing a very proprietary type of stuff where they just don't want to, so intelligence, surveillance, whether it is public or private sector, absolutely will do that on-prem, right? So most of them, even though they don't do full on-prem, they will make sure that there is network separation so that no one can get into it. So infrastructure as a service, you deal with anything below virtualization. So Rackspace, DigitalOcean, even though if you ask them, they will say, no, we are a platform as a service. For the most part, they're an infrastructure as a service. They give you the things that are above that operating system level, and then you deal with the rest of the stuff, with that, right? So platform as a service, is really your GCP, AWS, of the world. And that's kind of where, companies like us, and I'll get into why, we'll get into the details of why it makes sense for us to run our own data center versus using a platform as a service kind of vendor like AWS or GCP. I can probably talk about it because my last 3 jobs as a CTO was to move from on-prem or data center to GCP or AWS. So I have dealt both of them, and there is a bunch of misconceptions about why you choose platform as a service. So I'm going to go through that. And SaaS is like you don't really deal with any of these things. As a business, you say, this is a problem I'm trying to solve. This is what my software is expected to solve for me, and I don't want to deal with any of these deployment concerns, right? So, it is, there's varying degrees of benefits. There is varying degrees of autonomy that you get with each one of these things, but there's no it depends on the situation, it depends on the industry, it depends on what you're trying to solve for, that determines what is the best approach for you. But for majority of the businesses in this day and age, SaaS is probably the best option for varying reasons, right? Let's get into why is SaaS attractive for businesses, right? There's a million different reasons. I kind of have not presented this list purely from a technology standpoint. At the end of the day, decisions are made based on financial outcomes, business outcomes, right? That's kind of how decisions gets made, right? Technology does play a role, but the decisions are made based on the business outcomes and the financial outcomes. So one is, focus on the business, not on the software, right? Even when we are deploying our own software, what are we telling our customers? Focus on your customer, not figuring. That's really why SaaS is, as a general concept, very powerful, because you really don't have to worry about understanding the mechanics of how a software is built and deployed. You focus on the value that you're going to get out of it, right? That's why SaaS is extremely beneficial for businesses if deployed correctly. The ability to amortize cost and other financial benefits. Amortization is an interesting concept, right? So from a cash flow perspective, it is extremely beneficial for businesses. But most of the time, if you do a overall operational cost in a 3 to 5 year horizon, you may look at it and say, well, SaaS is more expensive, so let's go develop it. And those analysis, this is not happening anymore because most companies are smart enough to understand why SaaS is beneficial. But when you do that analysis just purely from a cost perspective, you lose out on other dimensions that you need to consider if you ended up developing the software yourself, right? So they usually look at the amortized cost over a period of 3 to 5 year time frame and say, oh, it's 40% more expensive or 50% more expensive from a net present value perspective, so that we can develop. IT organization, no disrespect to any of my IT folks who are here in the building. It's, as an engineer, I can tell you I have done this mistake. When people came to me and said, hey, Chethan, should we build versus buy? What is the natural tendency for us as an engineer? Oh, we can build it. I mean, there's no need for anyone else, But the cost is not a very tangible, just how much money you're going to spend. There's an opportunity cost for the business. There is cost associated with business continuity risk. All of those things needs to be factored in and assigned a value to be able to say, what is the true cost of building it ourselves versus that? Fortunately, that argument, that convincing is not needed anymore. So all of these things are kind of become common sense for businesses that are making decisions. So most companies know, if it is not our core competence, it's better to buy a SaaS software and start using it, right? Usually, there is no upfront cost. There's an asterisk associated with it because every time you deploy SaaS, you will have to do some configuration. Depending on the complexity of the software, you may have to do some configuration. So depending on the complexity of the software, you may need consultants who can come in and configure it the way you want, right? For example, there is no upfront cost if you want to use G Suite, right? You go sign up and start using it, right? There's no upfront cost. That's usually the benchmark we should use if we are deploying SaaS software for small and medium-sized businesses, right? That's why I kind of want to bring it home. That's why the stuff that we are doing in terms of self-configuration, reducing friction, ease of onboarding is all important because guess what? Our software will work. It can be configured and deployed for any customer, but the scale and adoption is only going to come if it is easy and you can self-discover, if the businesses can self-discover the capabilities in the product and start using it. The best example I can give you of a company that has really embarked on the self-discovery thing, there are two companies, is Atlassian and Slack. Atlassian, if you have dealt with their salespeople, they don't negotiate. Because why? They deployed their product from a grassroots level. If you go to a modern day software development organization and you're hiring someone and you say, we don't use Jira, we use, I don't even remember the bug tracking system. Huh? ServiceNow or just say Bugzilla, right? Bugzilla was a big thing. The people will laugh at you and say, you know what, I don't want to work at an organization that doesn't use an Atlassian product for software development. It's kind of become why they did not go and they made it a grassroots. Slack was the same way. Slack actually gave away the collaboration stuff for development and technology organization to go try it. They self-discovered stuff, and the product became extremely second nature for most of the organization, right? So the scale is only going to come if it is easy to use. People can self-discover, right? Self-discovery is another way of saying, if you're going to tell people, you got to go, I'm looking at Kara here, got to go read a huge manual. I think that option is going to. There is some class of, there's always going to be, in a business like ours, there's going to be a class of customers who are typically in the 10 to 15% of our customer base who will absolutely need handholding, who will absolutely need training because their needs are different, their complexity of deployment is different. But those are also high-value customers for us, right? Those are much bigger ACV for us. And so it's important for all of people who are in engineering and product to also understand where the financial manager hat and understand how decisions are made when software is being procured. The access to new versions without having to upgrade, right? You can go into, I'm a big fan of G Suite, so it's an open secret. You go into G Suite every day, you discover new things, right? And so that's because they're deploying software, and modern day software has to be deployed on a daily basis with incremental values so that, again, it hinges on how well is your software developed for self-discovery. Because if your product is not built for self-discovery, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot by doing daily deployments because people don't know how to process it. That's why what we are doing right now is an important step towards enabling continuous deployment because self-discovery is an essential attribute of a good SaaS software to be able to do continuous deployment. So there's a method to the madness for the stuff that we are trying to do and the stuff that I'm trying to push because there is a stepped progression towards getting to the state where you can continuously do deployments every day, push out new features. Ideally, what I'm used to is pushing out new features where most of the features are wired on, not wired off, right? and I've done this at massive scale, and it is doable, but it requires a discipline and understanding the art of developing, good SaaS software to be able to do that with confidence. Scalability, performance, and security. Yeah, this was actually considered not an advantage of going to SaaS a few years ago, because people said, oh, you're in a shared environment, we don't have security, things are co-located, so we may not get the kind of performance we need. That's usually the argument that you would hear from IT teams. And my point was always like, okay, you think you can actually scale much faster than, how quick Amazon can add servers, or so. I think this argument used to be a knock against SaaS, but no longer, because most SaaS software can scale and perform much better than your in-house developed software. Yeah. And customization through configuration. It's important. The operative word here is configuration, not custom software, because and we'll get into why configuration is the key. So, we are doing things like feature flags. We're adding configuration. Why? Because we cannot anticipate everyone's need right from the get-go. We have a general idea of the problems that we are trying to solve, whether it is, communication pieces that we develop or the CRM capabilities. We cannot anticipate how the product needs to be configured and deployed for every customer use case. So having a robust set of configuration is extremely critical to have a broader appeal when it comes to any SaaS offering. Okay. I talked about this. Not all SaaS software is created equal. So I'm going to, it's kind of a leading question. But when I say SaaS, what is the first company that comes to mind? Who do you think pioneered the SaaS model?
Google.
Anyone else in the enterprise space? Google. Yes, sure. Google, absolutely. Adobe is one. Anyone heard about Salesforce? Yes. So if you go look it up, they all say Salesforce was the pioneer in actually starting the SaaS movement. In a lot of ways, yes. But if you look at, before there was SaaS, how many of you remember there was a model called ASP? Not the Microsoft technology for developing UI. There was a ASP model where you would it was kind of between platform as a service and complete SaaS. The idea there was that you as a company said, hey, I don't want to deal with any of these concerns that I laid out, but I need a dedicated environment that you manage and run. So they were also called managed hosting and all of that stuff. Contrary to most beliefs, Salesforce was not developed as a pure SaaS application. I'll go into the architectural principles that is needed to be called SaaS. They developed it as an ASP model. That means every deployment of their application was a single tenant deployment. So what that means is, if I had one customer, if Salesforce got one customer, they went and provisioned all of the things that I laid out for that customer. That, all the way from the compute capacity to network, all of them was separate. They was completely separated out. Now that was probably smart for that time because it allowed them to sell effectively, because they could say, don't worry, it's like managed service, but you get all the other benefits of what a SaaS should be, right? But as you can imagine, if Salesforce had continued down that model, they wouldn't have been a profitable company, because the cost of running a SaaS software like that is very expensive. You cannot scale, you cannot invest in innovation. So what that means is, let's talk about architecture integrity. For a SaaS company, or what to be called a pure SaaS, you need to be a single version multi-tenant application. What that means is, you have one code base that you're serving all of your customers with, and then you can truly do multi-tenant deployment. Now, some people will ask, what if I'm dealing with a bank who wants to deploy their, they want some autonomy in terms of how the data is sharded, how the data is co-located with others, how their traffic goes through those things. You can still do single version multi-tenant deployment and deploy and for those kinds of use cases. All I'll say is, assume a single tenant is a degenerate case of a multi-tenant, right? You can actually set up your deployment scheme where you just say, on this deployment, I only have one tenant deployed. But you want to build that architecturally into the product so that you can make that decision at deployment time, rather not build that into your code where it assumes it's like a single tenant deployment. So there's a marked difference. It's a geeky topic, but I want all of us to understand, if you're not doing single version multi-tenant deployment, you're not doing pure SaaS. And it's not just about architectural principles it does hurt you financially as a company developing SaaS software if you don't do that. I will give an example which is very personal to me. Some of you know I spent a year at Coupa. Coupa is we use Coupa here. When I went to Coupa, they were a competitor of ours, so I kind of, out of respect during the interview process, I did not even ask the CEO there, Rob, how do you deploy this thing? I'm assuming it's all single version multi. I assumed it because, like, come on. I mean, they're a Valley company, they're a lot more mature, and they're doing well. When I went in and sat in the first meeting, and they started talking about this customer has this version, that customer has that version, that is usually an indication that you're not deploying pure SaaS. And I spent almost 6 months after starting there convincing customers who were on different version to first get an auto upgrade program so that we can actually have fewer versions to maintain. As you can imagine, for a company developing SaaS software, if you support multiple versions, the complexity and the cost of supporting it goes up, right? And you cannot innovate, and you get into a maintenance mode. That's really why companies die if you don't adopt this policy. So it will be good initially when you are 5, 6, 10 customers. Sales can sell it, less friction, you're able to deploy, manage differences between customers very easily. But once you get past the escape velocity, you're going to die. You're not going to reach your orbit, because when you develop multiple versions, engineering teams cannot scale, the product innovation stalls, bugs starts creeping in because you're not able to test everything. When you go from 1 to 2 version, and it's not a linear scale. Oksana will tell you it's not a linear scale when it comes to testing. It is a logarithmic scale when you go in terms of version, because the permutation changes, the code is changing, you cannot do continuous deployment. You then naturally settle into like a waterfall model where, like, we're going to do deployments once every 6 months so that we can mitigate the risk. That's what companies do. But guess what? There is a price to pay. It doesn't matter whether you do it every month. At the end of, it's like, racking up credit card debt. You're going to pay the price no matter what, but it just depends on when you pay for it. And you're going to pay more. So that's why single version multi-tenant is an extremely important principle to adhere to if you're going to create a scalable SaaS business. And that, to me, that's why I put it as number 1 here, because if you don't do that, you're going to fail as a company. The second thing is also a very misunderstood term. There's a difference between authentication and authorization. So, I don't want to, get too all geeky here, but, so just keep in mind there is a difference between those two things, and it's not the same. Configurability is key. You cannot create forks in the code, right? This customer is asking for it, so in this condition, I'm going to create an if block, right, to support it. If statements are bad, contrary to what you learned in school. If you have too many if statements, it's bad. So configuration, how you actually create a scalable configuration of your product, is extremely important. This is microservices all the rage, right? So I have done. There are certain classes of problem that is very well suited to be built as microservices, but don't get too carried away by it. Domain services, which was the model that people used before there was this concept called microservices, and most companies that say we are doing microservices are not doing microservices, just so you know. So don't get too carried away, because there is a price to pay when you build too many microservices without thinking through the deployment concerns and the manageability concerns, right? So for the engineers in the room, keep that in mind when you're making decisions. It's okay to build domain services and not have to build microservices for every class of problem that you're dealing with. If you are if you want to come have a conversation about that, more than happy to. Real-time transaction does not mean it has to be tightly coupled, right? I supported a travel and expense product, which at one point of time supported 50 million users monthly globally across 8 different countries. We did real-time transactions, but not everything was synchronous, calls. Meaning, if I initiate a transaction on the web page, if you do real-time transaction, people will say, you need to make REST API calls or API calls to other systems that you're dependent on so that you can ensure, real-time nature of your transaction. You don't have to. You can actually do things without having things to be tightly coupled. And I can talk to some of the messaging approaches that you can use to make it look like a real-time transaction and yet scale much better than having to do API type, tight coupling. And REST APIs are not the only answer for contract-driven design, right? REST APIs, as good they are, there are certain drawbacks with that, versioning, authorization concerns, authentication concerns. But if you make your systems loosely coupled, meaning you actually have a contract, most REST API contracts are implemented by JSON schema. So you can exchange JSON schema not necessarily through REST APIs. We are using Kafka topics for some of the things that we're doing right now. Guess what? It's easy to scale a messaging queue than having to scale an endpoint, right? There's still processing happening in those endpoints, don't get me wrong, but there are ways to implement a contract-driven approach without having to necessarily rely just on REST APIs. Measure usage metrics so you can make good data-driven decisions, right? I was talking to someone this morning. So there was, and I'll talk about why measuring everything is important, right? So when I was at Deem, when we were developing a travel product, there was a large customer who used our travel product across 170,000 employees globally. So there was one button in there which was called the carbon calculator, meaning when you travel, they would actually say, click on this button so you know how much carbon footprint you're leaving. So the idea there was that when you click on that, people will look at it and say, okay, maybe I should not travel. This is not a mandatory travel. So the idea was that you'll save on travel costs, right? By, it's kind of making people feel guilty about traveling, right? I mean, people who travel will travel. Having supported that business for 8 years, I know there's a reason why travel business is still up and running, right? So there was some, I'm not going to go into the detail. There was some issues where, we were relying on a third-party service to get the carbon data. There was issues with that. So I looked at the usage. It was less than 2% usage. And when I looked at who was using it, it was people who were trying to enforce it, not the travelers. So I made the decision to take it out. I said, look, this is not needed. It's not helping. It's actually hurting. And obviously, the two people, out of those 170,000 employees who probably, suggested that as an idea to start with, all were up in the air and like, oh, you cannot do this. This is huge. It's going to hurt our business because people are going to spend more. Whereas, I said, okay, we'll put it back. When we put it back, I just put the button back. It didn't do anything. There was a static page in there that just said, hey, here's it. And we let it run for 30 days. And the data didn't change. Only 2% of the people were clicking on it. And when we did the IP tracking, and the user tracking, it was basically those two travel agents who were mandating that, who were using it. None of the travelers were clicking on it. And then a month later, people were like, oh, see, this is useful. People are using it. And did your travel go down? No. Your travel has remained the same or it has gone up. Are people using it? And the answer was, oh, yeah, they're using it. Whereas the data showed no. And I told my team, like, look, no one is using this thing. So I measure everything so that you can actually take emotions out of decision making and rely on data. Now, I will also tell you, having said this, you cannot make every decision as a business when developing software just based on pure data. There is, successful companies do use instincts. So you have to be pragmatic. That's why I didn't say this is a science, it's an art of developing SaaS software. So you got to take some risks. You got to have some instincts of why you're doing something and not just say, oh, data doesn't tell us this. So, if that was the case, Apple would still have a keyboard. on its phone. So there is both sides of the coin. Availability, performance, and scale. Strive for 100% uptime, right? And it is possible in this day and age to have 100% uptime. Strive for it. I mean, there is the 5 nines, which is considered the gold standard. But I think if you strive for it, I think you will make the decisions that allows you to at least get there. Availability is key for driving adoption, right? If your application is not available all the time, it doesn't matter. Maybe it was for that 5 seconds that it was down when people were using it, it drives away adoption. People will say, people will overgeneralize, right? It might be something that was only down for 5 seconds. So the number, this is where data may not tell the full story, right? In those 5 seconds, it might have been the biggest decision maker at that company who tried to log in and it was not available. And they say, no, this is not reliable. So that's why having uptime and availability is important, because you never know when you're a SaaS company, you don't know where people are, how people are using it. There is a difference between availability and uptime, right? So I'll give you a good example. Again, going back to, you might be, you could say my uptime is 5 nines, 99.999, right? But if you had a certain functionality that is heavily used, right, was not available for an extended period of time, your uptime numbers are great. You conform to your SLA. That's why most companies on the contract, SaaS companies, will put uptime on the contract, not the availability. Because availability is one, difficult to measure and enforce, but that's where you can make a difference. If you focus on availability, meaning are the most used capabilities in my product available all the time? For example, in the travel product that I was developing, if the uptime was 99.99, but my air booking or hotel booking went down a couple of minutes every day, is it a good thing? No. That's why availability and uptimes are different, and you need to be honest. To me, the honest to God metrics to measure is availability. If you can say 95% or more than that of functionality that my customers use is available 100% of the time, it's okay. I'm not saying it's okay meaning screw uptime. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is availability is a more important measure in terms of the quality of the software that you're putting, in terms of the value that your customers are getting out of it. So focus on availability and uptime, and they're two different things. Understand your customer SLAs, right? Because most engineers, right, do not really take time to understand what SLAs are we signing up with our customers. It's important because let's say if the SLA says 0 downtime during this time of the day or this time of the week, you may have to factor that one in if you're doing a data migration, right? So having engineers understand customer SLAs, I'm not saying every contract, but have an understanding of basic constructs in which SLAs are written. It's not just the responsibility of the field organization. I mean, because SLAs are something that the product and technology organization have to implement or adhere to. So it's important to understand that. This is different from the support SLAs. This is, but it's important to understand what the customer SLAs we are signing up for. Oh, understand when to be fast and when to be smooth. So without naming names, I was talking to someone who was trying to bring in data, right? Data import is a very common thing that we do. And there was like, I don't know, 10,000 users, to be brought in. And the point was, this 10,000 users is taking 3 hours or 4 hours to take, right? We need to speed it up. My first question was, why do you want to speed it up? Okay, we are a SaaS business, right? Our way we scale our business and way we maximize our margins is by serving all the customers well, right? When you are fast, first of all, you need to understand you need to be fast, right? In this case, if the SLA was, if I have a bulk user import that I'm doing, I want these users to be available in the system in the next 24 hours. Do you want to be fast or smooth? Because if you're fast, guess what? There's a price to pay. Someone else you're eating up on the resources, or something else is getting dinged, right? So what was happening was, in this case, you don't have to be fast, you want to be smooth, meaning you want to make sure that you can adhere to the SLA, you will get that done, get the upload done in a reasonable amount of time, and it will absolutely get done. So there's a difference between fast and smooth. So understand when you want to be fast, when you want to be smooth. Just being fast is not always good, right? It may like, what the hell are you talking about? No, it is true. In a SaaS business, you got to understand when you want to be smooth and when you want to be fast. There's certain classes of problems where you want to be smooth rather than fast. And that's not just for our reasons, but there's also advantages for other customers that you're serving. Adopt scaling patterns that are best for the use case. Just don't assume that if you just cache everything, it's all good. I'm just picking up one thing, but there are different use cases that will require different kind of scaling patterns. Instrument code, other than measure everything from a usage perspective, this is on you instrument the code so that you can understand the performance metrics and the scaling metrics so that the engineers and engineering teams can look at it and say where you can optimize, right? Because, don't optimize before you know there's a need for an optimization. So instrumenting the code will help you do that. There is more than one sharding scheme. I'm not going to go all geeky about it. One of the common sharding scheme that SaaS companies use, we're going to shard by tenant. What happens if your tenant is one of the tenants is too big, right? So you need to have, more than one sharding scheme. There are several schemes, but keep in mind there's more than one. And test for both performance and scale, right? I personally think is limited availability is better than no availability. So that's why testing for performance and scale is extremely important, because without you doing that, you don't know where you're going to, fall off the cliff, if you cannot scale. Security and compliance. One of the reasons the SaaS type of offering deployment is acceptable is because people are starting to trust. So trust is something that's very difficult to gain, right? It's easy to lose a customer, difficult to gain one, right? So security is one area where you need to be super paranoid about. So you have to be hypersensitive to security concerns. You also need to be very careful about, storing the type of data in your system, because with all of the data privacy, it started with all of the European regulations, but now CCPA, which is a compliance thing that we are adhering to, is a lot more stringent than the European regulations. So we need to be careful about what kind of data we bring in. That's why, when I talk about, when I talk to solutions delivery about what kind of data we're integrating with, let's not become the world's database, right? Let's look at what kind of data needs to live within our system versus what kind of data needs to be linked out to, right? Because that's a very critical decision we need to make. Have a basic understanding of security and certification and compliance. If you don't know, just spend an hour with John Coffey. We'll be more than happy. And talking with John Coffey, maybe it would be a good idea to do a Devs&Bytes, to have him come and talk about some of the recent regulatory things that we need to comply to and why it is important. Audit the changes, right? If you can audit your changes, you can actually adhere to a lot of the compliance requirement a lot more easily, right? So the barrier for complying is going to go down if you're auditing all of your changes. OAuth top 10, I'm not expecting you guys to memorize this, but just going into the OAuth top 10 list, at least once a quarter, once every 6 months is a good thing, because there is some very pragmatic set of recommendations that you can implement as a developer as part of your coding practice that will allow you to be a lot more secure when you're developing software. Role-based access control can be a good friend when it comes to data privacy, right? Data privacy is becoming a bigger and bigger concern. You cannot anticipate all the things that will be required of us, but if you implement a strong role-based access control mechanism within the software, you can try and do those compliance a lot more easily. Devs can test for security vulnerabilities too. There are ways to do things within your development ecosystem and not wait for a penetration test or a quarterly test to tell you where the vulnerabilities are. If you guys are interested, go to Portswigger or some website like that, which will allow you to plug in things into your Maven build or your even Jenkins build loops, so that you can actually know ahead of time where your security vulnerabilities are. Keep up with the news and events. There's a lot, things that happen which are zero-day vulnerabilities. That means as soon as it is discovered, people can hack it, right? There is a bunch of stuff. There's some things that are at the software level, some things that are at OS level, but keeping up with this is important. The last one is kind of more of a protocol. Understand how to deal with security incidents and protocol. Security incidents are one of those things where it's okay to be less verbose in your Jira tickets. Because even though you may think that by putting a lot of information about a security incident in a Jira ticket, you're trying to do a good thing, you're actually hurting the cause by putting too much information. The key is to mitigate the risk. The key is to minimize who knows about that information. We all want to trust our coworkers. I'll tell you, if you ask security expert, most of the fraud and breach happens from within the organization, right? So when a security incident occurs or you come to know about it, your first order of things is to go talk to the security officer, in this case is John Coffey, and need to know. Only people who are supposed to know. After it is mitigated, you can share it, but till it is mitigated, it's extremely important to keep the distribution to a minimum. Work with your incident management, work with John Coffey and team to make sure that you're good citizens when you come to know about a security incident. Deployment configuration. As I said, I'm a big believer in continuous deployment, which will require leveraging feature flags, getting to a discipline from a product perspective to support self-discoverability. Product configuration, feature flag versus app config, there are three different things. They're not the same. I just wanted to bring it to your attention, but if you want to talk about it, we can talk through that. Monitor everything and be smart about alerts, right? Let the system do the work for you, right? If you get alerted on everything, then you get numb to it. So be smart about how you get alerted on incident, so that when an incident occurs and you get an alert, you know that this is something that you need to act on. Supportability doesn't end with just good logging, right? Just because you're logging something doesn't mean that it is a well-supported software. There is more than that. You need to make those logs available for customer support and SRE teams so that they can actually serve the customer well. So keep that in mind when you think about, I've logged everything. Well, is the log accessible? Can the support team get to it? APM tools have become extremely powerful. We use New Relic. Use it to our advantage, right? Build some effective dashboards. If you are a team is building a new service, build a New Relic dashboard and hand it over to your SRE team or your customer support team, so that they can monitor that service, and you can focus on building software. And again, partner with the SRE and the cloud engineering team so that they can serve the customer well, and you can continue to focus. Engineers can continue to focus on developing software. So I think I covered the 4 key aspects that I wanted to cover from a good SaaS discipline perspective. And again, this is not the be-all end-all, but I think if you take this to heart and then look at every decision you're making when you're developing a new service and see how you're adopting some of these principles, I think over time you will develop better software. And there's a difference, there's an art to developing good SaaS software, and hopefully that's what I was able to convey. And I'll open it up for questions, but that's pretty much what I had.
Any questions?
The chat here.
Nope.
I couldn't have been that convincing.
Yeah.
I mean, you may disagree with some of the stuff here. That's fine too. I think there's a lot that we covered, but hopefully, you got the good summary of why it is important to consider some of these things.
So we plan on developing our own.
We have people watching at home
Oh, we do?
and in other countries, so if you would care,
Okay, I'll
please,
speak
to
into the
use
microphone. Well,
Thank you.
this better be
Much
smart then.
appreciated.
And I will repeat the question.
So we're obviously moving to supporting or serving our software via our own servers, and this potentially would make things more secure, kind of for us as well, I imagine, instead of it being available on other people's servers and those kinds of things. Was that part of the consideration?
No, I don't think security was really so if you look at our business, right, having done 3 transformations right now from going from data center to AWS or GCP, the costs are much higher if you go to AWS or GCP. And if you want to provide the kind of SLA that we need to provide on the voice side, you need to have a significantly higher level of investment either on AWS or GCP if you want to support that. That means it's no secret, a majority of our revenues today comes from voice. And even as we pivot into our NextOS SaaS offering, there's a good part of our investment that we have done in the communications platform, which we'll leverage as we differentiate, right? So there is a sunk cost for us in order to guarantee that level of SLA, for our customers. So that means we cannot, run our voice business effectively on AWS or GCP. So if you're going to do that, and we're going to invest in those things, it just makes sense for us to deploy our other products too on there. So that was the main driver.
That was the main driving force.
Correct.
Awesome.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
What are some main ways to drive feedback from the end user or the customer and then implement those easily?
Great point. So the question was, what are some of the good ways of getting feedback from the end users and implementing it effectively, right? I think the traditional way has been ask them, right? Do so. That it doesn't work, right? It means it depends on how you answer the survey question, right? So in my experience, the best approach has been measure, right? If you measure what people use, how people use the product, you then can get a lot more insights into how people are using it, and then can incorporate changes into the product based on the usage information that you have. You can always supplement that by actually doing focus groups and studies and things like that, but don't rely on just those things to make your decisions. But if you have good data, and then you can do some focus groups, then you can correlate them and say, okay, are the 2 sides of the experiment or study telling me the same thing, and then you can make a more informed decision. So the best way is to measure the usage data, have a discipline of processing it and interpreting it correctly, and then using that to feed it into the product. Yeah.
So I know this is a little outside of the role, but can you talk a little bit about what it means to be a designer in a SaaS company?
Yeah, I think when you're developing, the question is, Ellen's question was, what does it mean in this context to be a designer in this? At the end of the day, designing a SaaS product is a lot more complex and a lot more difficult than when you're developing a product for a specific audience, right? I think we have to understand that when we design something, design is an expression, is an art form, right? You're expressing yourself. It's an artistic side. There is science to it, but there's also a lot of art to it. As you know, when you talk about art, there is opinions, right? So a lot of times what happens is we may design something, and from our vantage point, we may look at it and say, this is awesome. This has to work. Everyone has to love this thing. But guess what? We put it out on the field, and guess what? Somehow the uptake is not there, right? So if you can measure the usage, if you can measure the, before I came to Nextiva, I was CTO at a large dating app company called Zoosk, where we supported 18 countries and 25 million monthly active users, right? we designed some, some really interesting stuff that we thought, for us it was easy because we measured conversion of people coming in through a marketing campaign and becoming a subscribed user, every day, right? So conversion was the metrics that we used, whether something is working or not. We would think about something that we were deploying and say, this has to really drive up conversion. And guess what? It would not. And something that was like, that you would argue and say, this is pathetic, this should really not drive up conversion, for some reason would drive up conversion. So I don't, so that's why I think the best way to be an effective designer here, Ellen, is to actually not fear failing, right? It's good to be passionate about what we are building. It's good to have a conviction, but also understand that some of the things that we may think will stick may not stick, and it's okay. That's why quicker iteration, getting something out much more quickly, measuring it, and acting on it is a lot more important than trying to be like, okay, So that's why, I'm pushing so hard with Ray and the design team, and also with Tom's, like, let's get this thing in front of customers, right? Let's understand the behavior, let's measure, and then see how it goes. So that's kind of, my long-winded answer to what it means to be a designer. It's very hard, it's very tough.
So you talked a little bit about self-discovery within the product
Yeah.
and how that can be a huge differentiator
Yeah.
and kind of help the product be successful. So how are we building in self-discovery within the product?
Yeah, so if there are two, kind of work streams that that we are starting to lay ground for self-discovery. And if you go talk to any of the designers, they will show you very happily. There is, it's kind of not a very, very, interesting name. Like, we call it onboarding checklist and the dashboard, like the landing page, the landing dashboard. What those two things are trying to do is to actually allow people, by bringing in capabilities that we have in the product that they may or may not know about, into one coherent experience when you're just getting familiar with NextOS, right? So we're starting to do that. It's pretty powerful. And I think if we iterate through that, we can promote self-discovery in the product and get effective. So those are the two things that we are starting to do right now, which I think will lay the ground for a good self-discovery strategy within the product. And I firmly believe if you do that right, that's where the scale is going to come from. So we have to do that. And I'm very excited about, about that. Will we get everything right the first time? No, but I think we are putting some good foundational blocks in there that I feel very excited about. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Yep. Thanks. So when, it's sort of like a two-parter, but one is when do we think that stuff will be ready? And then the other piece is, I know that like the partner beta, part of that, the point of that is to sort of observe how they onboard themselves without having those aided tools. So what do we hope that like what we learn from that will help better inform crafting the onboarding that
so
you
the
build in?
question was, how will if I understand your question, when is it coming out? That was the first question. The onboarding checklist and the initial landing dashboard, there are aspects of it which we want to get ready by launch, right? What I'm trying to, literally as we speak, tomorrow we are meeting with Thomas and going through, and with the rest of the designers, and going through, okay, here is the state of those two work streams. There is definitely certain things in there that are very visionary, right? So one of the things that I'm trying to do in my capacity is, how do you, there's a vision state, Ellen will appreciate, there's a vision state that you want to get to, right? But the vision state is meaningless unless you actually can show through an execution plan how you're going to get there. A lot of times the vision state takes 3, 4, 5 hops to get there. There is a reason, I always use Tesla example, though many people may hate Tesla. Elon is really good at presenting a vision, and then the people who support him actually are very good at, he has some amazing execution leaders there who actually say, that's the vision, guess what? It's going to take us 3 hops or 4 hops. What I'm trying to do is in my capacity here in this company, I look at Thomas has that vision, right? And the vision is spot on. Don't get me wrong. There's like what I'm trying to work with him on is like, Thomas, to get that vision, some of them is 1 hop. Some of them is 2, 3 hops. Now, anything that I have a conversation with him, which is 1 hop, it's easy. 5-minute conversation, done, right? Anything that is more than 1 hop is not a 5-minute conversation. So what I'm trying to do is if I'm going to serve this company well, it's really about execution, right? Most companies say we are innovative. If it is an idea that cannot be mass adopted by customers, it's not an innovation, it's an idea. There's a difference, huge difference between idea and innovation. So what I'm trying to do is to truly become an innovative company. That means you got to know how we're going to go from here to there, and can you show the path to get there, even though the hops may vary, right? So the first part, to answer your first part, we are actually striving to get, the initial version of that as part of the launch. We are meeting tomorrow to discuss what aspects. Eric just walked out. Eric is working on it. Nicole is working on it. Ray is helping out. So we're going to get there, and then as we learn through that, and the beta program is going to tell us, because the beta partners are a different target demographic, so they're going to tell us, like, but we need to incorporate that and figure out, how to. It's going to be rough because they don't have any hand-holding, right? So yeah, so.
We are out of time, but thank you, Mr. Chethan.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, you can find him on Slack, or you can just poke him.
Exactly. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.